3D Lab guest sessions are online technical talks or collaborative workshops with external practitioners or our in-house technical team. These sessions are hosted by the 3D Lab based at Wimbledon College of Arts, UAL. We seek conversations that reflect the richness of thinking through making, technical research and development, and practical learning and teaching. We aim to explore the making literacies that underpin making practice, and in doing so develop a learning resource within the context of performance and beyond. For previous sessions and to join our mailing list, please visit wca3dlab.myblog.arts.ac.uk. This particular session has been funded by CCW Learning and Teaching Fund, so we're grateful to David Webster and his team for seeing the worth in these sessions and helping us run them this term. I am incredibly grateful to Arantza for agreeing to talk with us today. And 3D Lab guest sessions, they are collaborative in a way. We want the people who come and share their work with us to have sort of a mutual benefit of this time. So whether it's a site of kind of, or a moment of reflection for them, or we've had previous guests who have shared projects which weren't able to be aired during pandemic times. So there's been a real kind of mutual benefit, and Arantza and I have had a few conversations in prep for today, and I, in hindsight, wish we had recorded those, Arantza, because they've already had immense value in thinking about the future of materials and the future of making, and being more conscientious makers in some senses. If you're a student, if you're a theatre design student or a costume student, you would have seen me poking you to go and have a look at Arantza's webpage, panakistudios.com, or her Instagram page at Panaki Studios. And that's partly because as workshops moved online, we're seeking ways to kind of talk about the tacit knowledge or the making principles or principles that underlie making practice. And one of those things was looking at people who approach making in really interesting ways and across several different disciplines. And Arantza works across film, theatre, design, food design. It's almost endless because there's some sort of prolific focus on making and process and material and materiality. It has been working with some really interesting people, including, I will get this wrong, Arantza, but you can correct me, Paul Contreras, chocolatier as well. So you can kind of see these really interesting areas where Arantza's work has landed itself. But also there's this kind of pinnacle moment of just reflecting on practice, and we haven't really had a session yet that has reflected on the impact of the pandemic and this year has on our practice, and I think we'll see, but I think Arantza will touch on a bit of that, how this year has impacted her practice and her approach to making. Arantza has been an associate lecturer at UAL, and actually we worked together a good number of years ago now. And you're also affiliated to researcher projects at UDK in Berlin, the RCA, and University of Leeds. So there's a huge breadth of value that Arantza can speak in today, and I'm incredibly grateful for your time. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Arantza.
Thank you very much, Ashley, for that introduction. That was lovely. It always makes me feel a bit awkward when somebody talks about you. Thank you very, very much. Yes, well, Ashley's mentioned that I am a textile artist and designer, and I am currently based in Brighton, but I've had the studio in a wide range of places, from the dodgy Hackney in the very early years to I was based at Cockpit Arts for quite a few years as well. I've worked from gardens in the West Country, and for the last nearly 4 years I've been based here down in Brighton. Pinaki Studios is a project-based textile studio, and that was quite a deliberate decision roughly about 6 or 7 years ago, when I came to the realization that there are enough products in the world particularly in textiles, and that I was much more interested in contributing to projects than making more products, filling up the world with more products. So Pinnacle Studios is an excuse for me to explore the limitless possibilities of textiles and its overlaps with other disciplines. So there are self-initiated projects, there are collaborations with other people, and there's also commercial commissions. And over time, and there may be a person in the audience is smiling, looking at this photograph. Over time, I developed a small network of amazing people with whom I used to work, depending on the scale of the projects and who had complementary skills to mine. And I wanted to pay homage to them with this hug, because I think we're all very short of hugs in the last few months. And this is where I am. This is my studio, this is my workshop. I'm right behind Hove Station, so not very far from London, and I share this unit with another small company. So we have a fully equipped print studio with exposing unit, print table, mixing area, steamers, and there is also a section that you can't see in this image where we do clean and design work, and there's also a storage space. And my starting point is always thinking through making, playing with materials and processes with my hands. Craft is very important to me, and I like to understand and think about craft in the way that Richard Sennett describes it in his book, The Craftsman, as an attitude, wanting to do what you do a little bit better each time. And the hand is somehow always present. It may not be explicitly present, but it is always somehow present in my practice. I'm very inspired by the passage of time and what time does to surfaces. So I've been playing and working with metal patinations and oxidizations onto textile surfaces, and also the possibilities of storytelling that derive and the evocative nature of the passage of time onto surfaces. So I've always felt, it felt like a very natural step for me at the time when I had just finished college. And I feel very much at home collaborating with costume designers. And I've had the incredible fortune over the years of working with some really amazing costume designers with whom I've learned, and I think I've grown as a creative person. But as I said, the studio works in a wide range of projects, and some of them are self-initiated. So I wanted to start telling you a little bit about this one, which was a window installation on a boutique that was originally on Lum's Conduit Street and then moved to Savile Row, and to my knowledge is now only online. The souvenirs entomologiques were gigantic insects that took over the windows of the boutique, and as well as the actual space of the boutique, created with fabric and fish bones and feathers. Some of them were kinetic, and it was looking at the life cycle of insects in parallel to what I was doing to fabrics at the time. And one of those pieces was made with this fabric. This is a distressed distorted silk organza coated with rust, and I was working at the time with rust processes, but also I did a creative swap, a small collaboration with a company called Based Upon, and they were working with a technology of coating of liquid metal onto surfaces. So they experimented with my textiles, and they also applied the coating, the rust coating, onto one of them. So when the fabric arrived to the studio, I had almost like a really light, sheer, thin sheet of metal. And coming from a print background, you always think of, but you can think of textiles as two-dimensional. And what I realized is that thanks to the coating that this fabric had, I should be able to sort of mold it and make it three-dimensional. And that was an epiphany moment for me, because, and I will explain a little bit further into detail what pleating what pleating involves and pleating entails. But the fabric, when I took it out of the mold, was a sculptural, obviously three-dimensional, and it had kinetic movement qualities. So I became absolutely fascinated by the craft of pleating, and have been developing an archive of pleating patterns that probably account for about 40 to 50 basic pleated patterns from which lots of variations can derive. Pleating is a very ancient craft. This is a pleating mold that I found in the Egyptian Museum in Turin, in Italy. And to this day, and see if the video works, to this day, pleating is done in exactly the same way. The material is placed between two molds. The Egyptians used to do them with wood. These days are made in paper. Sandwiched between these two molds and then submitted to heat. A bit of a low start, sorry. There we go. That should be in movement now. So you're going to see my hand splitting this piece of polyurethane. No, there we go. But essentially, the fabric is placed into the pleating molds and then it goes into a steamer. The fashion and textile industries to this day still works in this way. So these molds are hand-drawn, scored, and hand-folded. And there are a handful of companies worldwide pleating fabric. The one I would, if anybody is interested in a bit more into pleating, I would suggest that you look at the work of Atelier Lognon in Paris, an atelier that pleats the fabrics for most of the couture houses in France, currently owned by Chanel, I think. There are a couple of companies in the UK. There are some in Germany and the Netherlands. There are a couple I know of in the States, in Australia, and of course in China and Japan. And I wanted to show you, hopefully, what happens to the polyurethane piece that I was putting in the mold in this video. So with all of these elements, I've been extremely lucky to work with amazing costume designers, and I'm going to show you a few of those projects that I've worked on over the years. So these are the Braavosi, the inhabitants of this free city of Braavos in Game of Thrones, where the Iron Bank is. And I work with Michelle Clapton, the creative director of the costume team, on the development of the look of the inhabitants of Braavos, of the Braavosi. And we were looking at the Braavos are very wealthy, and they display their wealth in the adornments of their outfits. So they wear these very elaborate ruffs that are inspired by the 16th century ruffs. So I've included here a reference of Elizabeth I with one of those original ruffs. Of course, Game of Thrones is a medieval fantasy, and it's sort of set up in medieval times, but the references are very eclectic, and we were at no point wanting to replicate the original ruffs, but using them more as an inspiration to then create pieces like this. You can imagine I worked with a team of Game of Thrones for a couple of years, a couple of seasons, season 4 and season 5, although you see more of the characters in season 6. The scale, the meters of fabric that need to be produced for a production of that scale. So I was working in a beautiful garden in the West Country, fabricating. I've calculated that it must have been somewhere between 70 to 80 meters of fabric that was distressed, rusted, then pleated to create the panels that then made the ruffs, and also contributed to the look of Arya Stark when she becomes an oyster bender. And I think we see her in season 6, if I'm correct. I've also worked with Alexandra Byrne. She was the first costume designer to ever commission me. And many years after that first experience, I worked with her again, developing the prints for the skirts of Mary Queen of Scots and her ladies in waiting. I won't go into detail about the full story of Mary Queen of Scots, but as she arrives into the British Isles and she steps into Scottish soil, the mud of the Scottish land starts staining her skirts and develops a print in her skirts that tell her story. So the events that Mary goes through appear in the print of her skirts, and they change depending on whether she's in battle or she's pregnant or whatever is happening to her. So you're going to see here the skirts have been half made when they came to me, and then we're printing on partly finished garments. And this is another costume project, the last one that I did with designer Phoebe de Guy, with whom I've worked many times. And this is the arrival of another princess into the English coast, in this case, Catherine of Aragon. This is the sequel of the sequel of the sequel of The White Queen was the original series produced by BBC. That was then, the follow-up was an American production. It stars doing The White Queen. And the third of the series was The Spanish Princess, which tells the story of the arrival of Catherine of Aragon from Granada, in the south of Spain, to England, to eventually become the first wife of Henry VIII. And for these, we were looking at the velvets and the cloth of gold, the fabrics that were invented during the Renaissance period, and trying to recreate them, because I never talk about replicating, as we are very much recreating historical references that have to make sense within the context of a script, within the context of the story, and also have to respond to technical characteristics, if you like, depending on what the character is going through. So all these ideas of the passage of time, I've also applied them into interiors, into space, and the heavily rusted silk brocades became digital prints onto linen, onto wood. You see here the image on the right-hand side, that were then used for trays, onto vinyl for the British Library, and wallpaper. This is 2018. And I've also played with food, because I see a lot of parallels between the making of textiles and cooking. And I had at the time a visit of a couple, Eric, they mentioned in the title of the slide, Eric Spandel and Leslie Vanderloo, who had at the time a boutique shop, retail space of a single origin chocolate in Amsterdam. And we talked about this idea of mine of how the similarities between making textiles and cooking, and they're both keen cooks and keen eaters, I would say. And so with their help and the kind of sponsorship of Rococo Chocolates, who provided the couverture that they use for the testing of the machinery, I played and I learned some very basic principles of tempering chocolate to look at ways in which we could manipulate chocolate and make it look like the textiles. What was really interesting in the process was that even if initially the textiles were the starting point, eventually the chocolate was also informing possible textile outcomes. And everything that you are seeing, the chocolate pieces were perfectly edible, but I'm not a chocolatier, I'm not a chef, I'm an enthusiast. And my priority at the time was exploring shape and form with a material like chocolate. I have the pleasure now to be more in contact with people in the well, not the food industry, but with chefs, and I'm having some fascinating conversations and learning a lot from them. So this is more or less where I was. I've not shown you the work in a chronological order, but this is more or less where I was towards the end of 2019. And I started 2020 with all confirmed projects for that year, were stage projects. And I probably need to say no more. You can all imagine what happened. I realized quite early on that nothing was going to work. And like pretty much all of us, I've had to put my attention to some priorities, and I went through a process of acceptance of the situation, as well as outrage to how, despite craft, making, cooking, culture, keeping us all sound in our various lockdowns across the world, how little attention they were being given. And I think once I've overcome that stage of just outrage, I've been way more constructive. So I've been using my time to reflect a lot on the impact of creativity and making in the world. I've also been using my time to look at my practice from angles that perhaps in the past were only done within the context of the particular projects. And I'm currently involved in research, some of it self-initiated, with spin-offs, with wonderful spin-offs, and as well as a member of bigger research groups, as Ashley mentioned in the introduction, with the wearable computing team at UDK in Berlin, the University of the Arts in Berlin. So I've been looking at my practice from the angle of color, and very interested to sort of see with a bit of hindsight with what I had been doing with patinations and oxidizations. So I had been playing a lot with rust and copper patinas, as well as looking at the natural natural dyeing process of indigo, which also happens through a process of oxidization as the fabric comes out of the dye vat and it gets in contact with the air. So I've been spending some time thinking about what other sources I could extract color from, and the various concepts and ideas that derive from those. So I'm very interested in the connection of color to location, to territory, to the land. And I refer here, the first book that you're seeing here, the developments of the color palette for the prints of Mary and Mary, Queen of Scots. There were, we collected soil samples of the various locations in Scotland where they were filming for me to then develop the color palette for the prints. And I'm really fascinated by the idea of foraging the materials that can give us color that are linked to a particular location. So I'm calling that the foraged color. And the image that you have to your left, to the left of the screen, is color extracted from the leaves of vineyards, in Rioja in the north of Spain. I was brave and lucky enough to spend some weeks last summer in Rioja visiting the family, and I was extracting the color of those beautiful vineyards. I'm sure you're all familiar with the name of the region because of the wine. And I'm also very interested in connecting with a community of people around me and collecting their waste to then extract color. So I'm looking at these ideas of color derived from food waste and its connection to community and circularity. So using a lot of, and this is happening a lot in the explosion of natural color that we're witnessing, from avocado skins and avocado pits and onion skins and black beans and pomegranates and citrus. And extracting it not just as a dye, but also learning to actually extract the pigment as a way of stabilizing and archiving these colors. And as a spin-off of these investigations, I'm currently collaborating with a really interesting young chef, pâtissier, chocolatier called Paul Contreras. Paul is behind the R&D department of a really interesting restaurant in a small town in Rioja in the north of Spain. And he makes amazing bean-to-bar chocolates. So he's been providing me, and I've got some here. He's been providing me with the husks of his cocoa beans. Let me see if I can get some. I don't know if you can. Want to tilt the screen, see the camera sees it. Not sure if you'll see it. So he's been giving me the cocoa husks of the making of his chocolate bars, and I've been extracting the color from them and exploring the range of possibilities that it can give us to develop a color, an ink, a pigment, to then develop prints. This is a first print that we've done with the inks from the skins of the cocoa beans on paste silk. So it's silk that is created not harming the silkworm. And I'm also, and this was another gift of 2020, looking at the positives, part of a group of researchers, artists and researchers, led by Berit Grinke, a professor at the University of the Arts in Berlin, looking at pleated electronic textiles. So introducing electronic functionality within pleated structures. So let's see if this video works, hopefully. I've been looking at the movement of pleated fabrics and seeing the areas where, as the fabric moves, where the fabric gets in contact with each other to identify potential sensor layouts. And by that, I mean areas where I could introduce conductive sections that would to create sensors that could identify the movement of the fabric. So as the fabric opens and closes, that can be identified. So you see one of these fabrics in action. This is one of the functionalities. Right, so you get an idea. So these are quite a few of the experiments that I worked on during those 4 weeks that were partly done in Berlin and partly done here in the studio. I looked at binary switches, so sensors of the type that you've just seen that identify whether the fabric is closed or open, as well as etching techniques on copper-coated nylon, as well as variable resistance sensors, so sensors that can identify the gradient of movement of these fabrics. And this is done by a combination of bonding, fusing, and assembly techniques, where the various components of non-conductive materials, conductive materials, and resistive materials are held together purely by the pleats, making these fabrics, creating the possibility of assembling and disassembling these fabrics, making them potentially recyclable. So this is where I am at right now, as the world, at least in the UK, begins to awaken. And I find myself constantly asking myself lots and lots of questions, but I guess, and some of them are perhaps not relevant necessarily within this context. But the one that I suppose summarizes it all is that coming from a space or a mindset of sensitivity, where you're trying to work with, we're trying to achieve a zero waste production method and water-based materials, and trying to be mindful, to feeling responsible for the work hugely responsible for the work that I put out into the world. And I'm wondering often, what are the lessons that we can learn from this last year that we can take forward to, as creatives, contribute to better making in many ways, a much more mindful making, because time is ticking, I suppose. and on that note, thank you very much for listening, and I'll wait to hear your questions.
Thank you so much, Arantza. It's just so generous of you to be so honest in just sharing your process, and to give us an insight into where you've come from, which is probably quite a continuum. If we hadn't had this year, like I'm sure you would have, like you mentioned, you would have just continued on with those projects. I've got a few initial thoughts. One around the archive. You mentioned almost the importance of an archive in your practice, in a few different senses of potentially partly with the dyes, extracting dyes, creating a bit of an stabilizing the colors, archiving, and then also with your books of like color and sampling. We're always interested in the things we don't often talk about in the making process, and maybe the archive is one of those, in terms of it's a tool for us in terms of our making practice, of an act of remembrance, but also an act of kind of storage or inspiration. But I just wondered if you could maybe share a bit more about the role of the archive in your making process.
That's a really interesting question. I think it's come up as quite naturally for me, this idea of but first of all, I mean, there's a practical element to it. Let's start with that one. When you work on commission work, you need to have very good understanding of what you're making, whether you can replicate that, in which conditions you're replicating that, and so on. So I've had a habit of keeping notes, and those notes then became these books, where I basically keep record of every single little step I do. I also photograph it, and if I'm organized enough, I tend to print images, keep them in the books alongside swatches and notes. And it's been interesting how, as my practice has been evolving, these books have become more and more relevant. In the current year, well, in the last year, I've been looking a lot at them, precisely because of that. What is it that I've been doing, and what aspects of it I've only been able to develop within the context of this particular project that I want to take forward. And it's the same, I think it's the same with every tool. So I've been doing the same with pleating. I became absolutely fascinated by pleating, and I've been learning a lot about pleating. I've been learning to look at a pleated fabric and decode the diagram that generates the pleat, and then creating my digital archive of patterns and diagrams that I can then work with. And with color, it's just beginning to happen in exactly the same natural journey. With color in particular, I don't know yet where it's going. I'm just absolutely fascinated by what happens when, I mean, these are all lake pigments, and essentially in the dye liquor you add a mordant, and the color molecule attaches to that mordant, and you see it happening in front of your eyes. And when that dries, you've got the powder. And I'm just absolutely fascinated by that process, and collecting all these little bottles.
Yes. Yeah.
We shall see where it goes. I don't know yet, but it's opening up tons, particularly the color. It's opening up tons of questions about how can we work, especially in textiles and especially with color, in a much more mindful way, where the waste of one industry, and these are the conversations I've been having with Paul Contreras, the waste of one industry can potentially become the raw material for another one. And I'm quite excited to see that this is happening on a very artisanal, small scale level, like what I'm doing currently, as well as a much bigger scale where companies are actually connecting with the wine industry in Italy to develop materials and so
on. I guess that makes me think about the just the arc of even just seeing that initial the wood block of the Egyptian like pleating former, and I guess I haven't formed this question, but I think it parallels because your practice is very much, it's an ancient craft in some ways, working with fabrics and making it functional in your respects for film, TV, but you know, chocolate design, like there's an outcome from it. But just like you were talking about the historical references in the beginning, I love that when you were talking about the Game of Thrones, is that it's not particularly true to history, but it's referencing or recreating. I think you said not. It's recreating. It's not repeating. I think that makes sense. But that similar practice of being mindful of the context, but pushing forward in another sense, I think kind of mirrors a little bit of this continuum of practice, that actually it's a continuum, but actually we're pushing forward, thinking through how to, you know, now where you're at in terms of technical, the electronic kind of element of thinking how to assemble and disassemble fabrics. I'm not sure, you know, there's no question in there, but I just was trying to draw a parallel in terms of that making is a continuum, you know, like Richard said, the reference you said in terms of, you know, it's the attitude to the made world around and how we respond and be conscious makers. But yeah, I just wondered if you had any more to kind of unpack in terms of, yeah, this kind of the continuum of craft and the making principles that are underlying your practice. And just, I don't know, maybe just share a bit more about where do you think that's going, and can you see that parallel of, you know, of the arc of the continuum?
I think that was what was really interesting about putting this presentation together, and trying to sort of explain it in a way that was hopefully coherent, and where that interest in time, which started as looking at what happens to a surface when time passes on it. So when you expose it to the elements and something happens to it, and that was my starting point, to then find myself very interested and intrigued by the history of craft, and which is essentially the history of technology, and textiles are are essential to that, and seeing how that is still the foundations of how the discipline can move forward. And there's so much to learn in all these ancient processes, but then we are 21st century people, so how can we use them? I'm not thinking necessarily, I don't have a sense of nostalgia about them, but I think there is a lot of knowledge there that is maybe been pushed on a side. I don't think it's necessarily been forgotten, that can be brought back because there is something there to be learned. And I think that's happening a lot with color in the textile industry. So synthetic colors have been overtaken the world because, you know, they were cheap and they were consistent and durable and life fast, and now we find ourselves looking back at the ancient ways of making color, but hopefully with 20th century mindful brains.
Yeah. I mean, that makes me reflect on, you mentioned it very briefly, like the link or yeah, the connection with land and location, and you had those your sample books with the latitude, longitude, and I wonder if there's something there in terms of actually, you know, I guess in modern making practice we've been maybe divorced or separated or disassociated with the origins of our materials. You know, just thinking about the workshops, like we see a lot of plywood, a lot of MDF, a lot of, you know, those types of materials, and you know, sometimes we don't think further than, oh, they're just in front of us and this is the material we use, rather than going, okay, well, where is it made? How is it made? You know, what are the timbers? Where, you know, what are where the forests? You know, it's almost this question of going, you know, further back to, reconnecting ourselves with the origins of the material,
Of where they come from. I think it's something that, for instance, in the culinary world, they've been much more conscious of for a lot longer. And I'm not talking obviously about industrial food, but and it's quite interesting. I think because we've all been stuck in one place, not being able to travel, it's been a great opportunity to look at what's under our feet and where are we standing and what are our sources there, and be creative that way. What do we have? Do we need to go very far to source interesting materials to make with? And I think that's where my interest of that link and color and location lies. Is wherever I go, I've started going with a little notebook bag that I can forage things. And it is. It feels quite interesting having this conversation at this stage, because it's still all in the making. Everything that you've seen is work in progress, but it's definitely there, and I think it's a growing, much more global interest. So it's not just me, my little old me.
Well, I think that's what was encouraging in our previous conversation in prep for today. You mentioned, because you sit across so many industries, you know, you're kind of privy to a lot of conversations across film, theatre, design, architecture, you know, food. And I think what was encouraging was you mentioned, you know, a lot of people are saying there's no return, what's the forward?
Yes.
That is encouraging, isn't it?
Well, I think that's what makes me feel optimistic. That and young people. Sort of, I do hear occasionally, or when we go back to normality, and I think, well, if the normality is what we had behind us, I don't want to go back. And I think luckily there's quite a few of us that don't necessarily want to go back. This has been a painful period of time that's allowed us reflection, and we need to move on from here. So we've been learning, and I say we because I know of a lot of other creatives in various sectors that have just spent the time amplifying the repertoire of processes and materials, spending time thinking, learning new things to then use that to move on. So I think 2021 is still a wobbly year, and there'll be a lot to mop up.
Yeah.
So the list, but I think we need that level of That's certainly been my journey, that level of, I'm going to use the word outrage, what's been happening, because I think the pandemic has made so incredibly clear the cracks in our system, that we need to use the outrage in a constructive way. And we talked about, when we had previous conversations, we talked about Victor Papanek, an author that wrote a fantastic book that I highly recommend, The Green Imperative, written in the late 90s, early 2000s. And he was already talking about a lot of this. So what can we do in all the facets of our lives? So who we are as creatives, as friends, as professionals, as lecturers, as technicians, and how can we contribute to construct something more regenerative from all those different facets.
Yeah, you mentioned using making as a thinking tool right at the beginning, and we're a massive fan of that in the 3D Lab, and that has partly fueled some of our making literacies, or thinking through, what does it mean to be making literate in some ways, and is exploring making as a thinking tool, as something that can inform, the act of making can actually inform our design, and we like to kind of try and flip the processes, or make people aware of how design and making are really kind of integrated. They inform each other, and I think that there's problems when we separate the two in some respects. And you've shared a little bit about your line of inquiry, like how you potentially are playing with materials, listening to them, responding to them, and then working with them to certain points of outcomes, but it's a continuum of kind of discovery. We just, and you also mentioned making notes in the archive and like foraging, there seems to be practices that fuel your making process and approach to making. What is your starting point for your projects? Do you start with sketches or mood boards? Could you share a little bit about like how you would approach a project, or do you see it as a continuum of inquiry that sometimes has moments where you share that with the world, or it has an outcome? For instance, working with chocolate and the boutiques involved in that.
Yeah, I don't think there is it's not a linear path. It's more of a backwards and forwards and sideways, and it's a dialogue. It's an ongoing dialogue. Informally, I often say that I just fiddle all day. And there are days when fiddling is very frustrating and it leads nowhere, but you wouldn't reach a more interesting place unless you had a day of unproductive fiddling. I think this is a lesson I learned while I was a student, and it may help some people. I think if you are, it's very easy to get stuck in your head if you're just thinking. Some people feel comfortable just starting with a pen and paper. I find, and I've learned through my practice, that I'm more of a sort of three-dimensional thinker. So that making comes quite natural. Sort of folding bits of paper is something that I do very often, and then that may lead to a little doodle on a piece of paper, and then that may lead to collecting something that I'm going to boil, to then dip some fabric in, and then it occurs to me to mix it with a particular kind of pleat. And that is ongoing, and it's been ongoing since, well, it's never stopped, essentially. My first degree was in fine art, and I was a printmaker then, and it was when I came to the UK to do a master's in textiles that I learned that the process that worked for me was much more organic and ongoing. And in this ongoing, what often happens is I resolve a particular piece, and it may be, well, in the past certainly was exhibited somewhere, and that would lead to a certain project. that was certainly the journey in my collaborations in costume. And then you work with a team of people in a film, and that project leads to another one because you're known for doing certain things, and that leads to another one, and so on. I've also been very open to what these projects had to teach me. And I've allowed myself to be quite porous and challenged by the project. So there are certain things that perhaps would have taken me a lot longer to do, but had no Alexandra Bell come and said, well, we need engineered prints and they're going to be printed with mud. How can we do this?
Yeah.
So I think it's the journey is not in one line. And rather than starting with a piece of paper and drawing, I find, perhaps I can turn the camera and show you the wall that is in front of me. I just find myself fiddling with a lot of different things. And of course, with experience, you have certain strategies of what you're perhaps wanting to test. But that comes with time. Initially, there's a lot of play and you're just learning from it. And you're thinking with your hands.
Yeah, we often, you know, I guess in this year we've been forced to try and articulate the things that come so naturally to us in making spaces like studios and workshops. But as soon as we haven't always had ready access to that, we've had to kind of think, oh, hang on, what is it that we actually do? And I think you've spoken about it in terms of making practice is often led by research and curiosity. So research is as much part of the process as, you know, that's kind of integral with making the making process, materiality, and kind of, you know, the technical research and the problem solving behind it. But yeah, I just hearing you talk about your approach kind of highlights that, in the sense that, you know, it's not a kind of yeah, it is a continuum. I think I just have that word today. You know, it's so fascinating just to see how it's a practice, and it's you know, it's something that you put in place, and it's driven by certain rhythms and forces, you know, with you responding to the challenges ahead, I guess, and what we have in place. But we've come to our hour's end, but I just want to say thank you so much for your time. I know you put you've given us so much time today, as well as in prep for today, and thank you so much.
No, thank you, guys. It's been great fun, and it's been really, really helpful to put the story of the studio together.
So yeah, so just a formal thanks to Arantza, and for everyone joining us today. Thanks for your time. Just a reminder, if you want to be on our mailing list, do just drop us an email at wca3dlab@arts.ac.uk. You can catch up on previous sessions on our blog, wca3dlab.myblog.arts.ac.uk. And we've now got an Instagram. We're now one of those people that has an Instagram account. So follow us at WCA3DLab. We promise to try and be somewhat interesting and give you an insight as to what's happening on the ground and online with the 3D Lab based in Wimbledon College of Arts. And yeah, just a big thanks to David Webster and the CCW Learning and Teaching Fund for funding today. We really appreciate your investment in these sessions.